Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 478. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how's it going?
Doing well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well, Connor. Happy to have you back on. We got a great show lined up for everyone today. Just want to take a quick second to mention that me and Connor were on the Crashing the War Party show with Kelly Vlahos and Daniel Larison, and that is coming out, should be around the same time as this show. And so really cool to be on with Kelly and Dan. And just everybody go check that out because I think, Connor did a pretty good job and I probably did all right too. And with that, just mention that you can find everything we do at the Libertarian Institute or at antiwar.com, including this show. And the show has a Twitter page at con_interest. All right, news today. Got a little bit to talk about here, Connor. First up, North Korea warns U.S. has world on brink of nuclear war. And this is probably the last of my write-ups on the UN General Assembly. North Korea, I guess, because of their status in the world, has to speak at the very end. And so we had a speech on Tuesday by the North Korean representative to the UN, that's Kim Sung, and then also the head of the UN, Antonio Gutierrez, both warning about the risk of nuclear war. In Kim's statement, he said to the General Assembly, owing to the reckless and continued hysteria of nuclear showdown on the part of the United States and its following forces, the year 2023 has been on record as extremely dangerous year, that the military security situation in and around the Korean Peninsula was driven closer to nuclear war. Due to Seoul's sycophantic and humiliating policy of depending on outside forces, the Korean Peninsula is in a hair-trigger situation with imminent danger of nuclear war. He went on to bash Washington for attempting to create an Asian NATO that will bring a new Cold War structure to Northeast Asia. And so, Connor, I mean, everything that the North Korean representative is saying here is really correct. I mean, the U.S. has deployed more strategic assets to the Korean Peninsula. Seoul has welcomed this, unlike with the previous administration in South Korea under Moon Jae-in. There was an effort to negotiate with North Korea and to reduce tensions on the peninsula. However, the current president, Yoon Suk-yeol, has really embraced Washington and militarily so requesting more strategic weapons, more weapons that carry nuclear weapons to come to the Korean Peninsula, not less. And so this has been a major escalation, but additionally, the White House has worked to mend the relationship between Japan and South Korea. And during a recent summit at Camp David, Joe Biden signed an agreement with Tokyo and Seoul, vowing to increase military ties between the three nations. And Connor, I don't know if you saw this, but Victoria Nuland had a meeting with, I believe, her Japanese counterpart about that trilateral pact. And the grin on Victoria Nuland's face in that photo was just very concerning. This is a woman who really loves war and who really believes the world should be rearranged and operate in the way that her and her neocon family believe. And so this is really, really concerning when she is happy. So we also had the UN Secretary General Gutierrez expressing his concern that global tensions could lead to a nuclear war. He said any use of nuclear weapons anytime, anywhere, and in any context would unleash a humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions. Gutierrez stressed that nations must be prepared to uphold their commitments to never use nuclear weapons and work towards eliminating strategic arms. And Connor, as we talk about on the show all the time, we are not moving in the direction of reducing nuclear weapons. The U.S. and other countries are modernizing and expanding their arsenals. And additionally, that is really led by the U.S., probably multi-trillion dollar effort to upgrade our entire nuclear triad, new land-based missiles to launch warheads, new bombers, new submarines, all kinds of new delivery systems, and it's going to cost the American taxpayer a lot of money. But then, this is also going to prompt Russia and China to develop more advanced systems to deliver their nuclear weapons, which the American war hawks are going to say, oh my God, Connor, can you believe what is going on in Beijing and in Moscow? They're increasing their nuclear abilities. Now we have to spend even more money to counteract that. A couple of stories here on China. before we move on to Russia stuff today. The Philippines wants to retake shoal from China in the South China Sea. This was from Dave DeCamp earlier this week at antiwar.com. The Philippines is attempting to retake the Scarborough Shoal, a disputed chain of rocks and reefs in the South China Sea that have been effectively controlled by China since 2012. According to Bloomberg, the Philippines Coast Guard Commander J. Terraria said on Tuesday, since the new administration took office, we have already strategized on how we can control, again, the Scarborough Shoal and especially the lagoon. And Connor, the U.S. has pledged to the Philippines that we will help them to defend their claims in the South China Sea. And so, we could be talking about going to war with Beijing over a couple rots in a body of water that most Americans probably don't know exist. So this is really wild and really dangerous. We also have China saying that they are going to carry out major drills around Taiwan. China's Taiwan Affairs Office said Wednesday that the purpose of the recent large-scale Chinese military drills around Taiwan is to combat arrogance of the Taiwanese separatists, referring to recent actions by Taipei to bolster ties with the U.S. and other Western countries. The Taiwan Affairs spokesperson said the purpose of the is to resolutely combat the arrogance of Taiwan's independent separatist force and their actions to seek independence. The comments came after Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen, hosted a delegation of 6 Australian members of parliament. Tai was seeking Australian support for Taiwanese membership in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, an 11-nation agreement. China is also seeking membership in the trade bloc, and the Chinese spokesperson said that Taiwan's participation in the economic grouping should follow the One China principle. And this, basically is the acknowledgement that Washington and Beijing had for decades, Connor, that said that, we recognize that Taiwan and China are part of the same entity and that, American ties, official ties, should be with Beijing and not with Taiwan. That's a part of the reason why Beijing has the UN Security Council seat and all that. So it looks like these drills are going to continue, and China is basically saying that the more we support Taiwan, the more confrontation there could be. All right, next up here, another one from Dave DeCamp. Biden hosts Pacific Island leaders as part of a strategy against China. So the Biden administration is hosting Pacific Island leaders for a second annual summit in Washington that as a part of the administration's strategy to counter China in the Asia Pacific. And Connor, there is, some really wild stuff going on here in the Asia Pacific and what the U.S. is trying to do. And they're trying to take a lot of these nations that are groups of islands that are spread fairly far apart in the Pacific Ocean, and they're trying to basically draw make an agreement with all these nations and then draw a line around all these nations and say that we could control whatever kind of naval activity goes on in these regions. And this is obviously an absurd stretch of any kind of understanding of how maritime boundaries work in international waters. But while the Biden administration says that China has no rights to the South China Sea, they're trying to claim probably a quarter of the Pacific Ocean as basically American territory now. All right, a couple stories on China, or on Russia and the war in Ukraine before I hand it over to Connor here. House kills Representative Matt Gaetz's amendment to ban the transfer of cluster bombs to Ukraine. The amendment failed in a vote of 160 to 269, with only 85 Republicans and 75 Democrats supporting the measure. And so, very disappointing, Connor, although, it does look like building some momentum here, possibly. It's more than we've had in the past. And so this could be worse, and was good to see that at least there was some support, but it's not going to stop the administration. There's already a law saying they can't transfer cluster munitions, and they're already doing it. And even if it did pass, my guess is this is something that would get stripped out in conference committee. But if you are trying to measure the level of support that this war has, there's probably now 85 Republicans. I don't think that the Republican objections here, even from Matt Gaetz, is really about the cluster bombs. Say if they were sending the cluster bombs to Taiwan to use in China, I don't think that probably these 85 Republicans would really take an issue with it. But they are looking to strip support away from Ukraine and what the Biden administration is doing there. And so that probably means there's 85 Republicans who are really now in the House alone that are really now against arming Ukraine. And 75 Democrats who are probably more opposed to the cluster bombs and the fact that they kill civilians in the long run than, they actually are to just arming Ukraine. All right, here, Russia says U.S. and U.K. helped coordinate attack on Crimea. And I mean, this seems to be the case, right? If they're using UK-made bombs and certainly U.S. targeting and intelligence, Connor, then the US and UK are very much involved. And certainly you could imagine the other way around if, say, the US and Russia were or let's say the US and Mexico were in some kind of conflict, right? And Russia was providing Mexico with the weapons to strike US cities, and China was providing them with the targeting assistance. I do imagine that Washington would say that they're directly at war with both Moscow and Beijing. And so that's basically the point that Russia is making here. And last up, U.S. tax dollars are subsidizing small businesses in Ukraine. And I just wanted to, I know we talked about this on the last show, Connor, but it's so important going into the weekend here. We're going to have the government shut down, this awful catastrophe. I saw a story on, I believe, MSNBC, Connor, where they were interviewing this lady who's saying that if the government shuts down, I'm not going to get paid for my job. She's like a trash collector or something in Washington. And, we're supposed to run a $5 trillion government because one woman who probably makes $20 an hour at best is going to lose her paycheck. I mean, yes, it's very sad, but, everybody has employers that, can't pay him at time. These kinds of things happen to a lot of people. It's a part of working for the government. You probably get a pretty good pension, but at times they could mess up your pay because Congress can't get their act together. And so I really just hate the way this all works out. And of course, we're going to keep sending all this money to Ukraine. So if the government really wanted to, they could keep paying all the people who make under $100,000 a year in the government their paychecks, even if they're not coming to work. They could just decide that's what they're going to do because the government could decide whatever they want. And so it's really the White House that's deciding not to pay that woman and to abide by this particular law. The law that says we can't send cluster bombs to Ukraine, Connor, never mind that one. We can do whatever we want. All the laws that say that when the government shuts down, you can't continue these ridiculous operations to fund a proxy war. Oh, we're going to ignore that law too. But the law that says that we can't pay this woman who picks up our trash and the people who clean up the Capitol and all these other, government, the flight controllers for the air traffic control and stuff, like all those people we can't pay, but the Ukrainians are going to keep getting their checks, and that kind of stuff just upsets me so much. So I want to mention it one more time as it looks like the government will shut down. And Connor, I was thinking we should start a campaign to have the government just shut down for 2 weeks to slow the spread. And we'll see definitely how long it lasts. But let's hand this over to you and give us some updates about the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a piece I wrote for the Institute here at the beginning of the week. U.S.-backed Kurdish militia imposes curfew in eastern Syria following clashes with another U.S.-backed militia. I guess formally U.S.-backed now with the Deir ez-Zor Military Council and the clashes with the SDF right now. But so I write that after the weeks of clashes between the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces and the Arab tribesmen aligned with the Deir ez-Zor Military Council, the SDF has imposed a curfew following a resumption of fighting on Monday. These ethnic tensions are boiling over in eastern Syria's Deir ez-Zor province, which is illegally occupied by the U.S. and its SDF partners as the Arab majority resists Kurdish rule there. So Syrian media and activists reported that the SDF imposed the indefinite measure across a handful of towns in Deir ez-Zor, including Zaiban. I've also seen this town called Dibon. In other publications, it's sort of like split. And I'm sticking with Zebon just because that's what I said in this article. And there's a lot of news coming out of this particular town here. It's close to the border with Iraq. But I believe if you see it in other publications, it has two different names for the same town. So Arab gunmen took over several positions in Ziban on Monday during which a number of SDF fighters were killed, according to the Pan-Arab TV station Al Mayadeen. And the SDF issued a statement saying that the gunmen entered Ziban while, quote, under the cover of random artillery shelling coming from the province's government-controlled town of Mayadeen. In Deir ez-Zor, Damascus controls the area west of the Euphrates River, while Washington and their SDF proxy occupy Deir ez-Zor east of the river. So the Kurdish-led forces have accused the Syrian government of allowing the Arab militiamen to cross the river. And so the statement also claimed that the SDF assisted in the evacuation of civilians to safe areas, namely nearby villages. Kurdish forces were also said to have fled the area in Ziban as the fighting exacerbated. Though Washington has backed some Sunni Arab groups such as the DEMC in the region in the past, the U.S. mostly relies on the SDF to control about a third of Syria, along with most of the country's oil and wheat resources. And there are roughly 900 U.S. troops and an undisclosed number of contractors embedded with the SDF. So as a result of this illegal occupation, the Kurds have dominated the area much to the disliking of the Arab population. The resisting tribesmen, along with their supporters, complain about the Kurdish authorities' corruption, drug smuggling, the misallocation of resources. There's a lot of people who say that the money is going back from a lot of the natural resources. The wealth generated from those resources in the province is just being sent back to the PKK in Turkey. And as well as they blame the Kurds for the Arab populations, the local indigenous populations' impoverishment, as well as their political repression and disenfranchisement. So Syrian journalist Ibrahim Muhammad has explained most people living in the province, quote, categorically refuse to be ruled by the Kurds. And the fighting started late last month when the SDF arrested the leader of the DEMC, Abu Khwala. And since then, more than 100 people have been killed. Now, Robert Ford, the former U.S. ambassador to Syria, has said that this current violence should not have surprised policymakers at all. He said anyone who was watching the deteriorating situation in Deir ez-Zor wouldn't have been surprised by this. As he recently said this in an interview with Middle East Eye. We're speaking with Middle East Eye for this article about the ethnic tensions and what's been building up all this time. And so Arab grievances against the SDF go back years, Ford says. Instead of the U.S. addressing those concerns and moving the Kurds out of Deir ez-Zor and bringing in local Arab leaders, it sat on its hands. Now, the Islamic State took over large swaths of eastern Syria and western Iraq as a result of the Barack Obama administration's failed regime change operation, which saw the CIA arming and funding rebel groups, including al-Qaeda affiliates, back when Ford was the ambassador. And the proxy war killed hundreds of thousands of people, but ultimately failed in its attempt to overthrow the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. And the terrorist group was all but destroyed by Damascus with help from its Russian and Iranian allies. So despite the claims of U.S. officials that the occupation is meant to merely deter the reemergence of the terrorist group, the American occupation is instead designedly depriving Syria of vital resources amid Washington's brutal economic war against Syria. So then there was an update to this story yesterday that I wrote for the Institute. U.S.-backed SDF militia shells positions taken by the Arab fighters in eastern Syria in this town of Ziban. So the Kurdish-led and U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces have moved reinforcements to the province of Deir ez-Zor in Syria for continued fighting on Tuesday. Arab gunmen associated with tribal leader Ibrahim al-Hifal took over at least 3 positions in the town of Ziban, located again near the border with Iraq, on Monday. And it sounds like a handful of SDF fighters were killed. I think 3 was the best estimate I saw. The fighters' ultimate aim is to entirely seize Ziban. And according to the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which supports the opposition to Damascus, they claim that over 20 Arab fighters, who they described as pro-government fighters, were killed during the skirmishes. Al-Hifal released a statement calling upon all tribes to help take the fight to the SDF terrorists. As he called them. However, as of yet, the majority of the tribes have not joined his fight. I think it's like 2 out of 16 that are going along with this guy and his attempt to take this town. And the SDF encircled the area on Tuesday and began shelling the positions held by the Arab tribesmen. The Kurdish militia claimed that it allowed civilians to evacuate before launching the assault, but amid the shelling, one civilian was reported killed. And this comes in the wake of a larger movement by the tribes resisting the Kurdish dominance in the province, where fighters have expelled SDF forces from parts of north and east Deir ez-Zor. So the SDF has accused Damascus of being behind the unrest and instability, although the local Arab population in Deir ez-Zor has long resented their impoverishment and repression under Kurdish rule in this territory occupied by the U.S. The province residences, in addition to complaining about Kurdish authorities' corruption, say that they're not receiving their fair share of revenues generated by their province's oil fields. And so the New Arab reports that the analysts have noted the perceived alignment between some tribal leaders and the Syrian government has caused divisions between members of the tribes and their leadership. Essentially, the accusation is that Assad is using these tensions between the Arabs and the Kurds as a way of destabilizing the area in the hopes that it will upend the U.S. occupation. Now, I don't know exactly what the proof of that is yet, but it sounds like there is that is starting to become more generally accepted among some of the population, some of the Arab population in Deir ez-Zor, and it's making, this is one of the reasons why Abu Khawla was arrested in the first place. Was he was accused of collaborating with Damascus, along with Iran and Russia by extension, and so there is this cynicism about what's actually going on there, and suspicion that Damascus is behind it. Either way, I mean, whether that's true exactly or not, there are these ethnic tensions, like Ford said, and the U.S. occupation is untenable. I think it was Joshua Landis who was explaining that this actually could be what ultimately ends the U.S. occupation, which before now seemed like it would remain indefinitely, just stealing Syria's oil and wheat. While the country is under these Caesar Act sanctions, crippling the country, after years of this proxy war, which, as we've discussed before, is going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild the country. But our government does everything they can to crush these people to death, where they're suffering under the sanctions. You have 90% people living below the poverty line, limited access to water, food, fuel, electricity, transportation, healthcare. And so, if this is what ultimately upends the occupation, because there's just no way, as Landis said, to basically rectify or reconcile these different these diametrically opposed national aspirations of these two groups, then so be it. The U.S. shouldn't be there in the first place, and they're illegally, invading a country and stealing their resources. It's one of the most blatant crimes against humanity, going on today. And so, we'll keep track of this story and see what's happening. Unfortunately, it looks like people are still dying by the dozens every week, but we'll have to keep paying attention to see what happens. I don't know how much longer this resistance movement can be sustained, but there's certainly some groups here that are intent on waging a guerrilla war here, at least for the foreseeable future. So this next story is again about Syria. The U.S. is getting behind support for these anti-Assad protests in southern Syria being led by a Druze spiritual leader. And so this is from Dave DeCamp. He wrote this up last night for antiwar.com. So a U.S. official spoke with a Druze spiritual leader to express support for protests against the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad that have been taking place in Syria's southern Suwada governorate. And the U.S. Embassy in Syria wrote on X that Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Ethan Goldrich, quote, spoke with Druze spiritual leader Sheikh Helmad al-Hajari, reiterating our support for Syrians' freedom of expression, including peaceful protests in Suwaida. Now, according to the Cradle, the protests in Suwaida, a Druze majority area, broke out on August 16th after the Syrian government raised civil servant salaries but cut fuel subsidies amid a collapse in the value of the Syrian pound. And the demonstrations have continued since then with calls for the overthrow of Assad. The three members of Congress also recently spoke with al-Hajari to express bipartisan support for the protests. Representatives Joe Wilson, Republican from South Carolina, Brendan Boyle, Democrat from Pennsylvania, and French Hill, a Republican from Arkansas. And so Boyle, this House member, told the National last week that in the discussion, he, quote, reaffirmed bipartisan congressional support for the peaceful protests in Suwaida during his conversation with al-Hajari. And so the support for the protest comes as the U.S. is looking to exert more pressure on the Assad government as more countries are normalizing with Syria. Assad recently traveled to China for the first time since war broke out in Syria in 2011. And we'll cover more on this next week as more details come out. But she announced that Beijing will now have a strategic partnership with Damascus. And I think they're looking at really incorporating Syria into the Belt and Road Initiative. And so back in May, of course, the Arab League voted to readmit Syria despite opposition from the U.S. And this followed on the heels of the normalization agreement that China brokered between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so on Wednesday, Senators Marco Rubio and Jim Rich introduced the Assad Regime Anti-Normalization Act of 2023. And this bill would expand sanctions on Syria in an effort to stop more countries from normalizing with Damascus. So the bill, which is the Senate's version of the one that was introduced in the House earlier this year, would extend the current sanctions on Syria under the Caesar Act, which deliberately targets the construction and engineering sectors, ensuring that no, business or individual of any nationality, any entity can do any business with Syria and try and help this country rebuild after all these years of war and devastation, waged primarily by Washington. In an effort to stop more countries from normalizing. And they would extend the sanctions on Syria under the Caesar Act to 2032 and prohibit the U.S. government from normalizing relations with Assad by law. And so the bill calls for, quote, a description of steps the U.S. is taking to actively deter recognition of Assad by other governments, specific diplomatic engagement and economic sanctions is what they're demanding. And it contains a provision that calls for the Secretary of State to provide Congress with a list of all meetings at the ambassador level and above between Syria and its neighbors, including Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, and Turkey. Additionally, the bill will require a review of all transactions, including donations over $50,000 in areas of Syria held by the Assad government made by anyone in those countries. This is a very invasive policy. And while U.S. officials claim to support the Syrian people, U.S. sanctions on Syria are specifically designed to prevent the country's reconstruction. That's from right out of Antony Blinken's mouth, and have had a devastating impact on the civilian population, creating the economic conditions that sparked these protests in Suwaida in the first place. Okay, but on top of that, Ukraine wants either the West or they'll do it themselves if we provide them the weapons, the wherewithal to do it. They want to start bombing Syria as well. So this is another one from Dave DeCamp last night at antiwar.com. Ukraine asks West to bomb drone factories in Iran and Syria. So Ukraine has asked its Western backers to bomb drone factories in Iran, Syria, and in Russia. The Guardian reported on Wednesday, citing a document that Kiev submitted to the G7 in August. In the document, Kiev alleged that the Iranian drones Russia has used to bombard Ukraine contain Western components. Now, Ukraine claims that Iran had diversified its drone program using a factory in Syria and that the production would eventually shift to Russia. The document suggests that the Western backers could launch, quote, missile strikes on the production plants of these UAVs in Iran, Syria, as well as on a potential production site in the Russian Federation. The document says that Ukraine could launch the strikes if provided with the weapons capable of doing so. The above may be carried out by Ukraine Defense Forces if partners provide the necessary means of destruction, it says. For their part, Iran has denied that it has provided Russia with drones since the invasion of Ukraine was launched in February of last year, a claim that Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi reaffirmed last week at the UN General Assembly. He actually challenged the West to provide proof that there's been any transfers of drones since the war started. The Ukrainian document claims that Iran is trying to disassociate itself from providing Russia with weapons, and cannot cope with the Russian demand and the intensity of use in Ukraine. There's no indication the U.S. or any of Ukraine's other Western backers would bomb Iran or Syria for Ukraine. However, Israel frequently launches airstrikes in Syria and covert attacks inside Iran, but that's been happening long before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The weekly Israeli bombings of Syria have been going on for years. So back in January, a month after Netanyahu took power again, the Israelis carried out a drone strike in Iran in the city of Isfahan. And U.S. officials speaking to the media conceded that this was Tel Aviv behind the attack. So in comments to the Wall Street Journal, U.S. officials noted that the attack came as the U.S. and Israel were discussing ways to counter Iran's military capabilities and its growing relationship with Russia. And I think it's always worth noting that, in the summer of last year, Iran was still maintaining a good relationship with Ukraine. In fact, they were relaying messages back and forth between both sides, between Kiev and Moscow during the early months of the war. So much so that a prominent Western leader, who's rumored to be the French president Emmanuel Macron, actually had a blueprint for a peace initiative, and he gave it to Hossein Amir Abdollahian, the Iranian foreign minister, who then gave it to Sergei Lavrov, his Russian counterpart. It was only a month or two later when this whole story exploded that Iranian drones were being used in the war in Ukraine, that then you saw these calls from Ukrainian officials saying, we're considering bombing Iran, and Zelensky demanded that Ukraine sanction Iran for at least half a century. And there was a meeting, because they have denied that the Russians have officially denied that they're using Iranian drones in Ukraine, for what it's worth. And the Iranians wanted proof from the Ukrainians that their weapons were being used to attack Ukrainian infrastructure or to attack Ukrainian targets in general, and so and kill Ukrainian people. And so they were going to hold a meeting in a European country, and I believe the meeting was just about to happen, or was very close to happening. A military and diplomatic delegation from both sides, but the meeting was squashed before it could occur by the West, by the United States, and apparently, at least according to the Iranian side, Germany played a strong hand in this, in making sure that this did not happen. So, and unfortunately, since then, we've just seen continued escalation and these calls from Ukraine for Iran, and now for Iran to be bombed. Just incredible the consequences of not only our abysmal Middle East policy and this indefinite economic war against Iran, which will eventually become a hot war if drastic changes aren't made. But it's so politically untenable. Biden can't even return to Obama's Iran nuclear deal with Iran, because even the Democrats won't support him. And then, of course, it's incredible that we're on the brink of nuclear war. And our proxy is calling for us to go to a war with a country of 80 million people concurrently. Just unbelievable. So now this next story is interesting. In the midst of this attempt to forge a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, the White House's top priority in the Middle East is, from all appearances anyway, we see now that Saudi Arabia and China are going to hold their second ever joint naval exercise. So I don't know what that says exactly, but again, I think Saudi Arabia has so much more leverage here in these negotiations than the United States or Israel does. And so this is from Dave DeCamp from today, actually, on the 28th. So Saudi Arabia and China are set to hold their second ever joint naval exercise as Riyadh continues to move closer to Beijing. And this was from the AFP reported this on Thursday. The quote, "This joint training focuses on overseas maritime counterterrorism operations, conducting exercises on sniper tactics, boat diving, helicopter landing, and joint rescue," said Chinese Defense Ministry spokesman Wu Qian. The drills will take place in October in China's southern Guangdong province. The last time Saudi Arabia and China held joint naval exercises was back in 2019. Wu said that Saudi Arabia and China are, quote, aiming to deepen practical and friendly cooperation between the two militaries and improve the level of practical training for the troops. The new drills come as the Biden administration is discussing the idea of a mutual defense treaty with Riyadh as part of a potential normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. The U.S. is looking to counter China's influence in the Middle East, but that has not swayed the Saudis from forging stronger ties with Beijing. Now, the U.S. and Israel envision the normalization deal between the Arab states and Israel, known as the Abraham Accords, as being the foundation. This is the idea is to turn it into an anti-Iran NATO-style alliance in the region. But a Chinese brokered rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran has thrown a wrench into those plans. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia's recent diplomatic maneuverings and growing ties with China give Riyadh quite a lot of leverage to get what it wants out of the U.S. for normalizing with Israel. And according to the New York Times, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman regards a potential mutual defense treaty with the U.S. as, quote, the most important element in his talks with the Biden administration about Israel. But we've also seen these reports that the U.S. is looking for, Riyadh is looking for assistance from the U.S. to build its civilian nuclear energy program. But we've also seen reports where it appears that they're also leaning toward just making a deal with China for the same thing. And again, that just raises the stakes for the United States because their real goal here is not only just to benefit Israel and help normalize their apartheid state, but also because they want to curtail China's influence in the region, and they don't want China. I mean, China's doing hundreds of billions of dollars of bilateral. The trade volume between China and the Arab world is huge, and also, of course, with Iran as well. They have this 20-year comprehensive partnership. It's worth $400 billion or something like that over 20 years. And so there's so much investment going in to the region from China. And of course, they're not exporting, war and sanctions and bombings. And military alliances eyeing future wars, bigger wars down the line. And so making a deal with them seems much more advantageous. Also, they want to actually, I don't think there's much, possibility here, but the Chinese have expressed an interest in mediating peace deals between not just Iran and Saudi Arabia, but after that, they were saying they'd like to help negotiate something between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And of course, the U.S., a big part of the policy now is to insist that Israel decrease their economic ties with China as well. And there's been some successes in that vein. But also there's lessons that Saudi Arabia is learning from what the Abraham Accords themselves, where the UAE has promised F-35s in exchange for taking the political hit in the region for normalizing and recognizing Tel Aviv. Without, in the absence of a Palestinian state and just continued repression and the expansion of settlements and, creeping annexation of the West Bank, especially with this Netanyahu's coalition, which is hell bent on just annexing the whole West Bank and is full of these Jewish supremacists and extremist settlers and carrying out war crimes in Jenin and elsewhere, which is horrible optics. And we've seen that actually quantified in these polls coming out of places like Bahrain and the UAE. But the UAE didn't get those F-35s because they refused to cut business ties with Huawei, the Chinese tech giant. So the Saudis are seeing that the United States certainly can't be trusted. And this is obviously a great negotiating tactic. Now, this next story here we have with Tehran is saying that Netanyahu threatened to nuke Iran in a UN speech here at the General Assembly last week. So this is from Dave on the 27th. Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Iran has lodged a formal complaint to the UN accusing Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, of threatening a nuclear attack on the Islamic Republic. Now, in his speech at the UN General Assembly last week, Netanyahu said, above all, Iran must face a credible nuclear threat. As long as I'm prime minister of Israel, I will do everything in my power to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. Netanyahu's office later said that he misspoke, insisting the prepared speech said credible military threat instead of credible nuclear threat. So Iran still issued the complaint, noting that Israel has an arsenal of nuclear weapons that it does not acknowledge. Iran's ambassador to the UN, Amir Saeed Iravani, accused Netanyahu of making, quote, explicit threats to use nuclear weapons against an independent member state of the United Nations. Iravani said the threat is more serious coming from Israel, which he described as an illegitimate regime that has been widely condemned for aggressions, for apartheid policies, for support for terrorism, as well as possessing an arsenal of weapons of mass destruction alongside advanced conventional weapons. The Iranian envoy said the use or even the mere threat of using nuclear weapons, regardless of the circumstances, by anyone at any time in any place, is a clear violation of international law. While Netanyahu and other Israeli officials are constantly sounding the alarm about Iran's nuclear program, there's no sign Tehran is trying to build a nuclear bomb, which has been recently affirmed by a U.S. intelligence report. And before that, of course, it was repeatedly confirmed by Bill Burns, the CIA director, but also in the Nuclear Posture Review and the Pentagon's new National Defense Strategy. There's just no dispute among U.S. officials whether or not Iran is seeking a nuclear bomb. And of course, they've been signatories of the Non-Proliferation Treaty for more than half a century. So, yeah, it's just incredible. And I don't think it was a slip of the tongue. I think he said that deliberately because the Israelis always say that, well, Washington needs to put a credible military threat on the table. It's constant that the only way we can deal with Iran is if we have a credible military threat. So it'd be kind of, who knows? Netanyahu is just a complete war criminal, and this is basically his bread and butter, so it's to be expected. But I won't expect any condemnation.
You could imagine him really liking saying that, knowing that he could retract it later and everybody would still pretend that Israel doesn't have a nuclear arsenal. And you could also imagine that maybe as he gets a little bit older, he really does have Israel does, believe it, or probably he believes that Israel needs a nuclear threat to combat Iran and they have one. But you're not supposed to admit that if you have a secret nuclear weapons program. So
I'm sure the Washington Post fact checkers and the State Department will be on top of this.
Oh yeah, definitely raise issues with the NPT and all the illegal military funding going to Israel. But anyways, Connor, we should wrap it up there for the week. Everybody, thank you so much for tuning in, and remember, catch us on Crashing the War Party. I always want to use the old name of the show, but Dan and Kelly were absolutely great, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. So everybody, thank you for tuning in. Back with more shows next week.